The office hummed with the sound of a centralized cooling system that never quite reached the corner desk. Sophia Martinez sat motionless. On her monitor, a single cursor blinked against the white void of a blank project file. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse that kept time with the silence of the room. She was an architect. Her hands had drafted the steel skeletons of 3 major skyscrapers currently rising against the skyline. She knew the load-bearing capacity of every beam and the exact tension of every cable. Yet, she looked down at the banking application open on her phone. The balance was modest, a thin buffer against the rising cost of living. She looked back at the screen. The cursor continued its steady, mocking blink. She had spent the last 8 hours designing glass facades for corporate giants, yet her own ledger remained static. The realization hit her with the weight of a foundation poured in winter. She was an expert at building structures that would stand for a century, but she had failed to draft a single wall for her own security. The screen glowed, indifferent to her state, waiting for a design that would only serve someone else. The office door creaked open, breaking the silence. 2 senior partners stepped into the corridor, their movements heavy and slow. They looked as though they had not slept in days. One clutched a lukewarm coffee cup with both hands, his knuckles white, while the other rubbed his temples, his gaze fixed on the floor. They spoke in low, jagged tones about interest rates and looming deadlines, their words echoing off the glass walls. Sophia watched them from her desk, unseen. They were the architects of the firm, the ones who signed the massive contracts and stood at the top of the hierarchy. Yet, their conversation revealed a different reality. They were drowning in payments, living for the next bonus, perpetually tethered to the very firm they owned. She realized then that their prestige was a hollow shell. They had spent decades building a legacy for the firm, but nothing for themselves. The realization sharpened in her mind like a blade. If the people at the top were struggling to stay afloat, the path she was currently walking led to the same exhaustion. She looked at her own hands, then at the empty desk before her. She was not going to follow their blueprint. Sophia reached out and pressed the power button on her laptop. The screen flickered, then dimmed to black, erasing the half-finished facade she had been laboring over for hours. The sudden absence of light in the room felt like a relief. She pushed the machine aside, the plastic casing sliding across the desk with a sharp, final sound. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. It was empty, the pages crisp and untouched. She took a pen from her desk organizer, the metal cool against her skin. She flipped to the first clean page and pressed the tip of the pen into the paper. She wrote "Financial Freedom" in bold, block letters across the very top. The ink bled slightly into the fibers, a permanent mark on the page. She stared at the words. They were not a design for a skyscraper or a request for a permit. They were a declaration. She felt the weight of the pen in her hand, a tool she would now use to map out her own survival. This was the foundation. Everything else would follow the lines she drew tonight. The office around her remained dark, but the page in front of her seemed to hold its own light. The next morning, the paycheck arrived. Sophia did not look at the balance as a number to be spent, but as raw material to be allocated. She sat at her kitchen table with a ledger and a calculator. The rule was absolute. Pay herself first. Before the rent, before the utilities, before the coffee, she carved out her portion. Her fingers tapped the keys of the calculator with rhythmic precision. She divided the total into 3 distinct columns. A portion moved into index funds, a digital transfer that felt like planting a seed. Another portion went into a high-yield savings account, a buffer against the world. The final portion was for assets, the building blocks of her future. She watched the screen as the numbers shifted, the balance of her checking account dropping while her net worth began to climb. For the first time, she saw the architecture of her own life taking shape. It was not a grand structure of glass and steel, but a foundation of math and discipline. She closed the ledger, the paper snapping shut. The feeling of uncertainty that had defined her nights at the office was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of control. She had stopped building for others and started building for herself. Sophia turned her key in the lock of her studio apartment. The space was small, barely enough room for a drafting table and a single bed. She kept the heat low and the lights off to save pennies. Outside, her car was a decade old, the paint dulling, the engine rattling with every start. She didn't care. Every dollar saved was a brick in her new foundation. At the office, The pressure was constant. Her colleagues gathered in the break room, discussing weekend getaways and expensive dinners. They invited her out, their voices bright with expectation. Sophia checked her list. A restaurant meal meant 3 shares of an index fund. She declined, citing work, and returned to her desk with a thermos of black coffee. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and confusion. They viewed her lifestyle as a tragedy of neglect. She viewed it as a tactical retreat. Every day became a test of Werportel. She walked past the display windows in the lobby, ignoring the temptation of new gadgets. She gripped her bag, focused only on the numbers she had calculated in her ledger. The silence of her apartment at night was not lonely. It was the quiet of a project under construction. She was building her exit, one sacrifice at a time. In the boardroom, the light caught the polished metal of a colleague's watch. It was a heavy, intricate piece, a status symbol that signaled success to everyone in the room. Sophia watched it catch the glare. She looked at her own wrist, bare and functional, and felt no lack. She had traded the desire for that weight for the weight of equity. Back at her desk, she opened a private browser window. The market was open. She did not look at luxury listings or travel brochures. She looked at ticker symbols. She initiated the buy order, her cursor hovering over the confirmation button. The transaction processed in a blink. She owned more of the company, more of the market, more of her own future. She refreshed the dashboard. Her portfolio ticked upward, a fractional gain that meant more to her than any physical accessory ever could. Her colleagues were spending their earnings to look like they had arrived. Sophia was investing some unhers to ensure she would never have to stay. She leaned back, the screen glowing with the data of her growing ownership. The satisfaction was not in the display of wealth, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of actual power. Every share was a silent worker, earning for her while she labored over blueprints. She closed the tab, returned to her architectural drawings, and felt the foundation of her life solidify with every passing second. The calendar pages turned until they ceased to be individual days and became a singular, blurred marathon of effort. 5 years. The discipline that once felt like a sharp, deliberate choice had settled into the very marrow of her routine. There were nights when the sheer weight of the repetition pressed down on her. She sat in the office long after the lights had dimmed, staring at a screen that offered no immediate reward for her restraint. The temptation to break the cycle, to spend on comfort or status, clawed at her resolve. She felt the fatigue in her shoulders and the dull ache of monotony. She pulled out her ledger, the ink faded from constant handling, and traced the lines of her growth. The numbers did not lie. Compounding interest was a slow, invisible engine, but it was gaining speed. She closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet of the empty building, and acknowledged the strain. It was not a sprint. It was an excavation. She stood up, stretched the stiffness from her limbs, and returned to her desk. The doubt dissipated, replaced by the cold, hard logic of the plan. She did not need the applause of her peers or the validation of luxury. She needed the math to keep working. She adjusted her posture and began again, the grind now a familiar, necessary partner in her climb. The digital graphs were no longer enough. Sophia needed to touch the floorboards of her future. She spent her evenings scouring archives and local listings, looking for what the market ignored. Most properties were polished, overpriced, and inefficient. She clicked through pages of sanitized interiors until she hit a single, grainy photograph, a duplex. The windows were boarded up, the siding was peeling, and the lawn was a patch of gray dirt. It was a wreck. Her instincts, trained by years of architectural precision, saw past the decay. She zoomed in on the structural lines. The bones were solid. The location sat at the edge of a district that was beginning to shift. While others saw a liability, she saw a project. She opened her notebook and sketched the potential layout, calculating repair costs against projected rental income. The math was tight, but it was viable. This was not a passive share purchase. It was a physical commitment. She traced the lines of the roofline on the screen, feeling the weight of the decision. This building was the first piece of hardware for her financial empire. It was unglamorous, neglected, and perfectly positioned for her to reclaim it. She bookmarked the page, her finger hovering over the screen, ready to transition from a holder of assets to a builder of property. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to amplify the gravity of the room. Sophia sat across from the notary, the thick stack of papers centered on the mahogany desk between them. Her hands were steady, though a cold tension tightened in her chest. This was the point of no return. She reviewed the final page, her eyes scanning the legal clauses that transferred the debt and the keys into her hands. The room felt small, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. She picked up the pen. It was heavier than she expected. She paused, the tip hovering just above the signature line. The doubt was a sharp, sudden spike, a reminder of the years of savings now about to be converted into a single, decaying structure. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the window, then back at the document. She did not want safety anymore. She wanted the foundation. She pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed, a dark, permanent line that bound her to the duplex. As she lifted the pen, the weight of the moment settled in. She was no longer just a person with a plan. She was an owner. She stood up, the signed deed clutched in her hand, and stepped out into the daylight. The street looked different now. It was not just a city. It was her territory. The duplex greeted her with a smell of damp rot and stagnant air. Sophia walked through the front door, the floorboards groaning under her boots. She didn't look at the peeling walls. She looked at the pipes. A sudden hiss broke the silence, followed by a spray of cold water from a rusted joint in the kitchen. She didn't panic. She dropped her bag, grabbed a wrench from her kit, and dove under the sink. The water was freezing, stinging her skin, but she tightened the bolt with a sharp, calculated twist. The spray stopped. She sat there in the dark, breathing hard, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the remaining water. This was the reality of her investment. It wasn't numbers on a screen. It was grease, iron, and sweat. Every weekend became a trial. She pulled up rotted boards, stripped layers of grime, and replaced failing electrical wires. Her back ached by Sunday evening, and her hands were stained with dirt that wouldn't wash away. But every repair held. Every wall she patched grew stronger. She was not just fixing a building, she was forging her own resilience. She stood up, wiped the grime from her forehead, and surveyed the room. The pipes held. The structure was beginning to wake up. She picked up the wrench, ready for the next leak. The keys changed hands on a Tuesday. The new tenants moved in with boxes of books and a sense of permanence that replaced the hollow echoes of the empty duplex. Sophia stood on the sidewalk. Watching them unload, she felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in her mailbox. She tore it open. Inside was a check covering the exact amount of the monthly mortgage payment. She stared at the paper. It was not a paycheck from the firm. It was not a reward for hours logged at a desk or for the exhaustion of a late-night deadline. It was money generated by the asset itself. The mechanism was working. She sat at her kitchen table, the check laid out before her like a map. The calculation was simple, yet the implications were vast. That money didn't just pay the bank, it bought her time. She looked at the duplex, then at the empty lot next door, and finally at the city skyline. Her ambition shifted. If one property could sustain its own debt, then two could generate a surplus. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching a new projection. The grind of the office was still there, but it no longer felt like a trap. It was now merely a fuel source for her next move. The second property was a brick row house with a sagging porch. The third was a small apartment unit in the industrial district. Sophia bought them 3 months apart. The pace was relentless. She spent her early mornings reviewing lease agreements and her evenings answering repair requests. The firm demanded perfection in her designs, but her mind was constantly calculating interest rates and property taxes. The balancing act pushed her to the edge. A client meeting ran long while a tenant called about a water leak, then another about a broken window. She stood in the office stairwell, phone pressed to her ear, trying to coordinate a plumber while scanning blueprints for the firm. Her calendar became a grid of overlapping obligations. She stopped sleeping more than 5 hours a night. Every spare minute was a negotiation between her professional reputation and her private business. She created a rigorous system of automated payments and outsourced maintenance, forcing the assets to manage themselves. The pressure was heavy, but the structure was holding. She walked into the office every morning with the same focus. Even as her portfolio grew in the background, she was no longer just an architect. She was a manager of systems. 10 years of entries filled the notebook. Sophia sat at her desk, the office lights buzzing overhead, and opened the final page. She pulled the bank statements from her bag and laid them out in a precise grid. She added the rental income from the duplex, the row house, and the industrial unit. She totaled the dividends from her index funds. She stopped. She looked at the number, then checked it against her monthly deposit from the firm. The figures were identical. The silence of the office suddenly felt different. It was no longer a space of obligation. She looked at her hands, then at the blueprints spread before her. The architecture firm paid for her time, but her assets paid for her life. The realization hit with the force of a physical impact. She leaned back, the chair creaking in the empty room. She did not need the firm. She did not need the partners. She had built a structure that ran without her input. She checked the math one last time. There was no error. She closed the notebook, stood up, and left her laptop open on the desk. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. For the first time, she saw the skyline not as a series of projects, but as a map of her own independence. Sophia stood. She did not pack her desk. She left her pens, her scale, and the stack of active project files exactly where they were. Her pace through the office was measured, deliberate, and entirely silent. She passed the drafting tables where her colleagues sat hunched over monitors, oblivious to the shift in the room. She walked past the break room, the smell of burnt coffee no longer holding any sway over her focus. Every step toward the executive wing felt like loosening a knot that had been tight for a decade. She felt the weight of the firm receding with every yard of carpet she crossed. The glass walls reflected a woman who was no longer looking for approval or a paycheck. She reached the heavy double doors of the partner's office. She paused. She did not hesitate because of fear, but because she was savoring the clarity of the moment. She adjusted her grip on the notebook in her hand. She took one deep, steady breath, feeling the air fill her lungs without the constriction of deadlines. She reached out and placed her hand on the cold, polished handle of the door. The transition was complete before she even turned it. She pushed the door open. The partners looked up from their screens, expressions tight with the pressure of looming deadlines. They did not notice the absence of her usual anxious energy. Sophia walked to the center of the mahogany desk and laid a single, crisp sheet of paper on the wood. It was not a request for a raise. It was not a complaint about hours. It was a formal notice of resignation. The senior partner picked it up, read the date, and looked back at her. His brow furrowed, eyes darting from the paper to her face as if searching for a hidden punchline. He started to speak, asking about the status of the stadium account and who would lead the next phase. Sophia did not answer. She simply waited. A second partner shifted in his chair, his hands hovering over his keyboard, suddenly still. They could not compute the math of her exit. They operated under the assumption that everyone was tethered to this office by necessity. They looked at her like she had just announced she was leaving the planet. They offered a counterproposal, then a threat, their voices rising in pitch. Sophia kept her posture level, her gaze fixed on the exit. She had already built her own foundation. She did not need their structure anymore. The street air was sharp and clear. Sophia walked 3 blocks to a corner cafe, the distance marking the final mile of her old life. She stepped inside. The space smelled of roasted beans and damp raincoats. Tables were occupied by people hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by the blue glare of screens. In the far corner, she spotted a young intern from the firm. The intern was staring at a monitor, fingers hovering over the keys, brow furrowed in a cycle of repeated errors. Every few seconds, the intern would slam a palm against the table and sigh, re-entering commands into the drafting software. Sophia watched for a moment, seeing the same exhaustion that had defined her own nights in the office. The intern was drowning in technical details, missing the structural reality beneath the pixels. Sophia moved toward the table, her steps light. She did not feel the pull of the firm anymore, only the weight of the notebook in her bag. She realized her time was no longer for drafting skyscrapers for others. Her mission had shifted. She reached the table and pulled out the chair opposite the intern. The intern looked up, surprised, eyes wide with recognition. Sophia sat down, cleared a space on the table, and set her bag aside. The transition from architect to mentor began with a simple nod. The intern gestured toward their laptop, pointing at a complex wireframe on the screen. "The software's the problem," they muttered, hitting a key that caused the display to flicker. Sophia pulled the worn leather notebook from her bag. She did not open it to a sketch of a building. She slid it across the wooden surface until it bumped against the intern's coffee cup. The intern stared at the cover, then back at Sophia, confused. Sophia tapped the notebook with a steady finger. "You are focused on the drafting tool. That is a mistake." She pushed the book further, forcing the intern to move their hand away from the keyboard. The intern opened it to the first page. It was filled with rows of numbers, asset allocations, and debt-to-income ratios. "This is not a project file," the intern said, voice dropping. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the intern's face. "A skyscraper requires a foundation that can hold the weight of the entire structure. If the footing is weak, the steel does not matter." She pointed to the page. "Design your life with the same precision you use for a foundation. If you do not engineer your own security, you will always be a component in someone else's build." The intern stopped typing. The screen's glow reflected off the paper. But for the first time, the intern looked at the numbers instead of the software. The intern traced a line of interest calculations with a shaking finger. The erratic clicking of the nearby laptop seemed to fade into the background. Sophia watched as the intern flipped through the pages, eyes widening as the math reconciled with the reality of their own stagnant savings. The intern looked up, the confusion in their face replaced by a sharp, sudden clarity. They pushed the laptop aside, clearing the table completely. The screen went dark, but the intern did not look back at it. They began to scribble notes in the margins of Sophia's blueprint. The mechanical tension in the intern's shoulders relaxed. It was an observable shift, a weight sliding off their frame. Sophia felt the air in the cafe grow still. She watched the intern map out a trajectory that mirrored her own decade of effort. The intern tapped the notebook, their grip firm. "I see it," they whispered. "The foundation is the priority." Sophia leaned back, her hands flat on the table. She felt a profound change in the room. The notebook was no longer just a collection of ink and paper. It was a bridge. Her years of work, the nights spent tracking assets, the early mornings spent fixing pipes, all of it had culminated in this one moment of transmission. She was no longer just building structures. She was building architects of their own freedom. Sophia stepped out of the cafe and into the cool air of the afternoon. She reached the sidewalk and stopped. Behind her, the glass facade of her former firm loomed, a monument to the grind she had finally escaped. She looked at the entrance, watched a courier sprint through the revolving doors, and felt nothing. No anger, no regret. She turned her back on the building and started walking toward the center of the district. The city noise rose up to meet her, the rhythm of traffic, the hum of distant construction, the rapid pulse of commerce. She stood at a crosswalk and looked up. The skyline was no longer a collection of structural challenges or design trophies. She saw the buildings as assets. She traced the lines of the towers, calculating the value of the square footage, the weight of the equity, and the stability of the income streams flowing beneath the concrete. She felt the heavy, quiet peace of a person who no longer relies on a paycheck to exist. Every window she passed represented a piece of the puzzle she had solved. The city had once been a cage of deadlines and demands. Now, it was a map of opportunity. She walked faster, her stride purposeful, moving through the grid of the city like someone who finally owned the ground beneath her feet. She stopped at the edge of the plaza, letting the crowd flow around her. The wind caught a loose page in her bag, but she did not reach for it. She thought back to that first night in the empty office. The blank screen, the blinking cursor, the paralyzing weight of a future that belonged to someone else. She remembered the scratch of her pen on that first page of the notebook. She had been terrified of the math, of the risk, of the long path ahead. She looked at her hands now. They were steady. She checked her watch, not to track billable hours, but to track the passage of her own day. The sun hit the glass towers, turning the entire city into a grid of gold and reflection. It was the exact structure she had once dreamed of building, but now it was real, and it was hers to command. She took a deep breath, the rhythm of the city syncing with her own. She had started with a single, fragile thought. She had finished with the immovable certainty of her own life. She stood still for one final moment, watching the light shift across the skyline. Then she turned and walked away. There was no desk to return to, no partners to satisfy, and no clock to beat. She walked forward, and for the first time, the path was entirely her own.